Hello and welcome to the studio. Today I'm featuring the Bob Ross classic Windy Waves. I think it was Series 14 Episode 1. Now this features something I've not painted before, on the channel at least, which is palm trees. I thought let's get a shirt out that really fits the occasion. Coloured of course in lovely ferns and palm trees. But the theme of this painting really is to do lovely big clouds, a nice big wave and those palm trees, but not to overstuff the painting. And this is a problem sometimes which I fall into the trap of, just trying to get in too much. So I've actually left out some elements of this painting, and I don't think it looks any the worse for it. But you decide. Now this painting has another unusual feature. It was painted with something called liquid grey. Now don't go hunting through the catalogues to buy some, you have to make it. Of course it's a little bit of liquid white and some liquid black mixed in, to make a sort of a mid-grey tone. Don't get too pale with that though. You want a colour that's reasonably strong to make these clouds really stand out. This is supposed to be a moody looking sky, thus the title Windy Waves. It's supposed to be like a storm on the horizon. But if you don't have any liquid black, you could in fact substitute maybe just a little tiny bit of black oil paint and just mix it in well. But again, don't let the background dry before you start painting. The routine. Sit back, relax, cup of tea, windy waves at the ready, and see if you can paint your version of this Bob Ross classic painting. Happy painting, people. So here's my canvas, 16 inches by 20, and today I need to put a horizon line on, and I'm going to use some tape, but I want to actually measure it this time for accuracy. 5.5 inches. There's my masking tape, and just make sure you press it down really well. Above will be sky, below will be sea. Now for my brushes, a couple of Bob Ross 1-inch landscape brushes, a nice new one, a fan, a filbert and a liner brush, and of course a Bob Ross palette knife. To make my liquid grey, I'm using some liquid black and a little bit of liquid white. I sort of blend them together in the centre until I get a colour I think I'm happy with. Now, using one of the old 1-inch brushes, I take a small amount and just work it into my canvas. Not sure if it's the right colour, but it's sort of a nice mid-grey colour. I want a thin, even coat all over, and I'll test it just as though I were testing liquid white. For my sky, I use a fresh, dry 1-inch brush. I don't want to contaminate it with the grey colour. I'm going to start with some Prussian blue with just a tiny touch of black. Now, starting in those top corners, I use little crisscross strokes to build up the colour. Notice that little hint of black in there. I should have tapped my brush on the palette a little harder. Next, use the same brush but go into a tiny little bit of crimson. Here I make a nice soft lavender colour right along my horizon line. Notice though I left that big patch in the centre for my clouds. Talking of clouds, it's time to start. A little cad yellow, just a hint, and some titanium white. Okay, now a bit more white. Maybe a bit more white. Look, let's just go for it. These big clouds look a little daunting, but notice how I use a little letter C shape, just as I always do. I focus on the light coming from the left-hand side and make these little sort of letter C's. As the paint runs out of my brush, I move into the centre of the cloud against that liquid grey colour. This gives my painting depth instantly. To soften my clouds, I use a nice new 1-inch brush. And I want to use just the corner of it, just to sort of soften up some of those edges where there's a little bit of heavy paint. But don't overdo it, leave the details in the cloud. Time to reload. Again, I put plenty on my brush on that corner and think about painting something, say, here. I want to trap a little bit of that dark grey colour between the cloud layers. Once you've done that, go back in with that 1-inch brush and more softening. I've repeated this step several times over to build up a lovely series of cloud shapes, one overlapping the other. I dry clean my nice brush for the last sort of fluffing up of the clouds. gentle pressure here, I just want to lift and separate some of the edges. It gives the clouds a really lovely airy feel. But it looked a bit like a triangle when I was doing this, so I decided to drop in another cloud. Make sure you stand back often when you're painting to make sure you're not sort of painting sort of shapes and patterns which really don't appeal very much. There you go. One final blend and my sky is complete. Time to remove the masking tape. I use my sky brush just to work a little bit of liquid grey into that gap. Don't worry if you leave a little bit of white showing through here and there. They look like distant waves to me. Now, time for some planning. I want to figure out where part of my wave is going to cross the horizon line, about a third the way from the left hand side. Notice how I just scratch into the paint to leave a mark. This is going to be the dip in the centre of my wave, and this is where the wave is going to go off into the distance. Here I want to work out how far over my wave should crash. Don't forget, if you don't like what you've done, you can always pick up that 1-inch brush and rub it out and try again. Notice the next angle is quite important. Slightly upward, going off to the horizon line from wide to shallow. This helps with the perspective of the wave. It's also the floor of the wave, where the wave hits the beach and the water is shallowest. There, I think that's about right. Over on the side here, I'll probably have some rocks. Above it, here, I'll have some beach. But let's darken the water a little more. Now, I've taken a little more Prussian blue and some black. This is where I'm going to have my beach, my shoreline, and maybe a little bit of surf. But, well, I didn't read the instructions properly. I'll darken this up a little bit as well. But as I said, I didn't read the instructions properly, and I should have added some phthalo blue and phthalo green. Well, it doesn't matter. I just scrubbed them in. Leave this area looking nice and choppy and rough. Now for the eye of the wave. I like to use my finger to remove surplus paint. It's tempting to use a paper towel, but I don't advise it. It tends to dry the canvas out too much, especially when you're trying to blend a nice eye of the wave. There, that's better. For the eye of the wave, I'm going to use a filbert brush. I take some of my white tinted with a little bit of cadmium yellow, sort of a very soft primrose yellow colour. Apply plenty to your brush and then go into the top part of the wave and really smoosh it in. That was a Bob word, but it really fits well. Press it into the canvas and just make little circular strokes to smoosh it in. We just want to make sure this paint really sticks well. Work away from the top of the wave and don't be tempted to go back. You'll contaminate your colours. I'll add a little bit more of that colour to the other side of my crashing wave, but it doesn't want to be quite so bright. I want that to look a little bit more sort of distant. Now back to my 1-inch brush that I used for blending my sky. I'm going to use these few hairs to blend the eye of my wave. Let's change the angle a bit. That's better. Notice how I tip the handle up so I can see over the top of the brush and see what those bristles are really doing. They're actually standing still and just sort of pirouetting, spinning on the spot. Let's do that in slow motion for you. Notice how those bristles barely move, even though the brush looks like it's actually moving a long way. The bristles are just touching and spinning in one place. The final step, I like to pull my wave around. Notice how I press and pull and introduce just the suggestion of a little bit of blue colour into the eye of my wave. It's just one of those little quirky things I like to do to add instant detail. Now, with my fan brush and some lovely titanium white paint, tinted with a little blue I might add just to soften it, I want to do the crash. This is where the water spills over onto the beach. Press, pull and let the brush fall away from the canvas. There. Don't go over it though. it'll take away all that lovely detail. Now for some foam. Again, I use my fan brush and you see I'm going in on the corner, just above the eye of the wave. I try and save a little bit of shadow, about here, but don't worry, we'll put some extra on in just a moment. Notice also how I lead my brush across the canvas. I don't push the bristles, it won't work. You have to lead with the handle. I carry on adding little touches of foamy splash to the tops of my waves. Now to make a little shadow colour, I dry clean my filbert brush. I take a little blue, a little crimson, and make a very soft purple colour. The shadow lives between the eye of the wave and the foamy top, in this little gap. I'll just dab the paint on to start with, and I'll blend it together with a dry clean filbert brush in a moment. That's a little bit dark, but it won't matter. We'll blend it all together. This gives the foam the appearance of some thickness, some depth. It's not just a flat white colour now. I dry clean my filbert brush and just touch these two colours together. Notice now how my foamy edge looks really sort of fat, has a little bit more depth. It's a small touch but makes a huge difference to a seascape. I'm going to go back in with my fan brush and just retouch some of that foam. I want a little bit more sort of movement there, so I give it a little bit more of a push. But don't overdo it, it can all get a bit out of hand. I'll also tap in some extra foam here, where the wave crashes onto the beach. I think it will be kicking up a lot of foam. Save a little shadow here and there. There we go. Notice how I tip my brush in different angles and just press, leaving little speckles of paint here and there. I dry clean that 1-inch brush one more time, and this time I've gone into some Van Dyke brown, but just a touch. I want to add a beach to my painting. I let the Van Dyke brown bump into the blue. At worst it will create a green tone, so perfect for a seascape. Now let's add some surf. I'm going to take a small roll of titanium white paint, but with a little bit of colour mixed into it. So this isn't pure white, it's just an off-white colour. It's got a little bit of blue and a little bit of yellow into it. It really doesn't matter. But notice how I use firm pressure. I push down on the knife and squeeze the paint from the heel of the knife and let it slide along. Then, using my fan brush, I want to just grab the back edge of that. And I've got my big fat fingers out of the way again. Oh well, we'll see that again in a moment. But notice how I pull the paint back and up into the wave. Steeper in the eye of the wave and flatter as I go to the left, as the wave hasn't risen so high. There. These angles are important, so make sure you follow them carefully. Now, I realise I should have put an extra feature in here, so I decided to come back in and add in a second little wave. I use some of the lavender colour just to push back a bit more shadow. This should look very familiar. Corner of the fan brush, just press in some foam. Use a little more pale lavender colour for a shadow and bring it all together by blending it. I'll just pull this little bit of foam back up into the base of that wave. Now for some rocks. I know that one or two of you struggle with rocks and you've asked me to paint some. So let's work on these rocks and I'll do it step by step. I first want to mark out where these rocks will be touching the beach. I want the rocks to be larger on the right and smaller towards the centre of the waves. This gives the impression that the rocks are going away from me and getting smaller and growing larger in the foreground. I use small rolls of Van Dyke brown on my brush just to block in the shapes, but it's not so random. I'm thinking all the time about individual rocks. Let's add another little row of rocks in the background, smaller than the first row, and again, just let them sort of disappear into the water. And to really add to that effect, let's add a third row of rocks poking out into the sea. Now, pay special attention to how I mix my highlights, or rather, how I don't mix my highlights. I take some Indian yellow, some dark sienna, and I put a little light colour down between them, some blue white, off-white, dirty white colour. I hold my brush extremely gently and think about where the light is coming from and how it's going to just interact with those rocks, how it's going to catch that left side, but it's going to leave a little shadow. Think about painting one rock at a time and just let the paintbrush bump and jump across the surface of that Van Dyke brown. Leave lots of shadow. You'll see in a moment how I come back and sort of work a little bit more shadow back into the odd rock here and there. I went slightly wrong there. I started highlighting the rock in the background. I'd sort of missed my position slightly. It doesn't matter, I realised in time. But can you already see how I've got 3 or 4 or 5 layers of rock from one dark shape? Here you see I dry cleaned my brush and picked up some more Van Dyke brown and just go back and punch in a little bit of extra shadow here and there to create a little more separation between one layer of rock and the next. Finally, let's settle these down into the water a little bit more. A small roll of titanium white paint on the edge of the knife. A little roll on the little edge is really useful just to work a bit of water in around the base of that rock, but save that shadow line. And finally, I just want to grab that little back edge and pull it back into the waves. Don't mind if you get a little bit of Van Dyke brown into that. It looks like the rock going down into the water has its own little shadow. Do the same for these rocks as well. Just touch, press and pull to settle them into the painting. Rocks are really not too difficult if you don't work them too hard, and that's one of my top tips. Paint them gently, and once you've done them, leave them alone. If you go back and fiddle with them, well, they tend to become muddy and mushy and they lose that lovely sort of vibrance. They do take practice, but practice holding the brush gently first. Now, let's have a look at the line here. I've got these all sort of lined up in a row again. I don't know how I do it, but I think I need to add something here to break that line. I'll add another rock on its own. Again, just a nice abstract shape. A few dots and dashes of maybe sort of pebbles and stones and whatever on the beach as well. Once again, a very, very loosely mixed highlight, just gently applied. I barely touch the rock, I just let the paintbrush just touch here and there and leave a little colour. Once again, I settle that down into the water with a few little surf lines. Notice that tiny touch of shadow purple behind the rock. It really helps the rock sit down in the water. A few little touches of highlight on the beach as well. It's time for a field trip. I like to throw these in occasionally to show you where we live. This is Seaford, which is just down the coast from where we are in Worthing in West Sussex. And as you can see, some smashing lovely cliffs and some smashing rocks, some big waves and a long shingle beach. I hope you enjoyed a quick trip out from the studio. So time to paint those palm trees, and I do it 2 different ways. The first way is the classic Bob Ross way with a fan brush, but the second way is a liner brush, and I feel I've got a little bit more control over what I'm doing that way and less likely to make a sort of a big blunder with it, but you decide what suits you best. Back to the painting then. Let's start by making a colour for the tree trunks. For this I'm just using some of my colours from the rock, which are a little bit sort of brownish in tone, with a tiny bit more white. Something very dull looking actually. There's nothing particularly bright about palm trees. Now, let's plan where this is going to go. Somewhere up in here will be the top of the palm tree. Lucky I didn't put a big cloud there. Well, maybe I planned a little bit ahead. I also want a nice little palm tree here, but that is going to go over the top of a cloud, so, well, we'll see how we get on. I quite like the position of these. I give them a little bit of a bow, and maybe I'll strengthen this one up as well. And add a little bit more Van Dyke brown to the back edges for a shadow. palm trees have got a sort of rough surface to them, so I just use the edge of my filbert brush just to give them a little touch and a pull, create sort of a nice texture to them. I'll improve that with a liner brush later on. Now, to paint the fronds, that's the sort of feathery bits of the palm tree, I'm going to take some sap green, some dark sienna, a little bit of black. I want a sort of an olivey green colour, but they're a sort of strange colour. They don't have a proper green colour, so I mix up what I think will work quite well. I look carefully at my palette. Can you see that wetness there? That's a little tiny drop of paint thinners. I want to groom this very wet paint through my fan brush. Give it a push to really open up the bristles. Splay them apart, because we're going to be painting the palm part of the palm tree next. Light's coming from the left, so they want to be brightest on the left, and go in and just touch and create a little line of paint. A little bit of a close-up here. Touch and give it a little pull, but let those bristles just open up. It creates all the little sort of tiny ends on the palm tree. It's really quite fun to do, but you can add too many and it kind of can get a little bit sort of like a clump at the end, but I managed to stop just in time. But this is why I like to use a liner brush to paint my palm trees, because it means I can be a little bit slower with it. I'll add a few darker ones here. There. Now, I'm sure if Bob had had time, he would have done liner brush palm trees as well. I add some thinners into that dark green colour again and load a lot of paint onto the brush. And I want to pull out the centre lines to these palm leaves. The wind is blowing them across from the left to the right. So I make sure all my little brush strokes give an indication that this is a windy day. And as you see, I just go down that little centre line and give the brush a small flick. It's nice and controllable, and it doesn't take long until you've completed a few leaves on your palm tree. Once you get the hang of it, you can't stop. You just want to add lots more. I add a few more darker ones here and there as well. And there we are. Palm trees, not so hard after all. Time to turn our attention back to those waves. I've got some off-white colour here. It's got some blue and a bit of green mixed in with it. Anything but pure white at this stage. I want to increase the detail in this area. On the face of the wave, you'll see lots of little bubbles and surf, little bits and pieces of detail here that just sort of kick up on the surface of the water. Notice how I follow the angle of the wave. Nice and steep inside the eye of the wave where the water's about to crash over, and how I let the water sort of flatten out a little bit more as I go towards the left. This is critical. You don't want your wave to look like it's just jumping up off the beach. Pay great attention to this when you do your own paintings. These are some lighter, brighter ones, and I'm going to settle them back into the painting a bit more using a dry clean fan brush. I just touch and press that detail down into the painting. It just sort of knocks the brightness off of it a little bit. Again, it's just a little thing I like to do on my own paintings, but you decide if you want them bright. I add a few darker ones as well up in the eye of the wave where the water is a little bit more transparent. Once again, gentle fan brush work to just to squash that paint down into the surface of the wave. I don't want to ignore this background either. There should be a little bit detail back there too, including on that horizon line where, well, I didn't quite get all the way to the edge of the sky, but it didn't matter. You can hardly see it now in the finished painting. And finally, some thinned, pure titanium white paint for a few speckles and bright spots on the tops of my waves. Perfect. If you've enjoyed my tutorial, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can give the little bell a ring as well. That means that you'll get all the tutorial updates as they come out. Now don't move, there's another lovely seascape painting for you to try next.